Some of the content and examples discussed may cause distress or be triggering, especially to those who have experienced or witnessed sexism, direct or indirect sexual harassment, gender-based harassment, assault, coercion, gaslighting, and or retaliation. In case you feel triggered by any of the content and need counseling assistance and or listening support, please message Elora. Her name on the Zoom call is Beej Elora using the private chat option.
Um, Thank you, Masoom, and thank you all for being here. On behalf of the Cree Foundation and my colleagues at the Beach Garage, I welcome you all to our first meeting of this year, Unmute, Breaking the Culture of Silence. It has been a few years now since the hashtag #MeToo movement. While in these years there have been public outcries and demands for accountability from a lot of powerful people in powerful positions across the globe, except for a few scattered incidents, the performing arts field in India has been conspicuous for its hesitation in speaking up. Perhaps we are still coming to terms with our negative experiences in the field. Perhaps we are grappling with the vocabulary with which to express these experiences. But those few scattered incidents in which people spoke up against all odds have been a great source of inspiration and critical to our being here today. So I wish with all my heart to express my gratitude for your bravery. We realize this is a difficult subject, but it is also very important that we begin to talk about performing arts, practice, and pedagogy, and begin to educate ourselves and ask the uncomfortable questions. Unmute has been conceived by Beach with Dr. Arshia Sethi, co founder of the Cree Foundation. The Cree Foundation was set up as an act of thanksgiving by Dr. Sethi along with internationally renowned dancer Rama Vaidyanathan. It was set up with a clearly defined mission and vision to leave the world a better place and do something every day towards this goal. Over the last year, Dr. Sethi has curated a series called Arts in the Law, which addresses issues usually never examined in the studio or classroom. In 2018, we hosted a panel discussion, Gendered Cultures in Indian Classical Dance. The panel led to an intimate circle of sharing and, most importantly, of listening and holding each other. The conversations led to a piece, Naika Interrupted, in which we attempted to question the Kathak form and its content in the context of consent. What we intend to do through this session is to educate ourselves, familiarize ourselves with the vocabulary of understanding sexual and non sexual harassment in the context of a usually disorganized workplace and studio or classroom, to understand our rights. In order to create safe, non toxic, non hierarchical, egalitarian spaces where making art or learning art is made possible and empowering. What this session is not intended to be is a name and shame. And this is important today because we would like to focus on the toxic cultures that are the enablers of violence. It is these cultures that we would at the moment like to challenge as opposed to certain people. Today, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Asia Sherwani, who is an inclusion and diversity advisor. Asia has played a key role in building diverse workplaces in diverse organizations and is leading the efforts to bring in substantive, effective, and legally compliant solutions which enhance gender equality, talent transformation, and people practices. She teaches courses on complex subjects like leadership, power, ethics, influence, and examines the impact of everyday sexism, misogyny, power play, and entitlement in workplace relationships and interactions. We would also like over here to acknowledge the work that has been done by several individuals and groups across borders in the last few years, and many of them are present amongst us here today. We have shared some of these dialogues on the Unmute event page, so I encourage you all to check them out. Unmute is only one step in moving forward towards together with kindness. Thank you. Can I ask Asia to please take the mic?
Yes. Thank you so much, Neha, for the introduction. And thank you to Cree and Beach for inviting me for this interaction today. I hope you all can hear me clearly. Should I speak louder? Are you all able to hear me? Okay. I'll I'll take that as a yes. Um, I'm very, very impressed with all the thoughtful conversations that have started in the performing arts world. I'm invited often to talk about legal aspects of sexual harassment, even though I'm essentially an ethos and ethics and values practitioner. So I'm particularly delighted to see the word ethics on the title of today's session. Whatever I've learned about organizational values, cultures, systemic change is through direct observation. It's through practice, it's through lived experiences, and it's through designing actions and solutions for people and for organizations. And I look forward to co creating with Cree and with Beach. Um, Ethics based and emotionally intelligent solutions which are tailored for the performing arts world and which make real change possible. So if we move to the next slide, I'd just like to share with you what I plan to cover over the next 40 minutes or so. So Masoom, thank you, Masoom. So this is how I thought we'll split today's session before I hand over to a panel that will help us contextualize and process whatever I present to you. So I thought the first bit will be about some definitions. So how is sexual harassment defined in the law? What are the circumstances around sexual harassment? What are some of the environmental factors that we need to think about while processing sexual harassment or while, as we use the word, unpacking sexual harassment? The second set of reflections I thought could be around non-sexual harassment, right? Things which don't fall into the ambit of law. Could we just stay on the previous slide, Masoom? I'm just covering previous. Yeah. Yes, thank you. So things which don't fall in the ambit of law, and we could discuss what we plan to do about those things. And then the third thing I'd like to talk about today is existing redressal mechanisms. Right? So, what are the ICCs? What are the other mechanisms? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the ICCs? How can we make the ICCs work? Do we want to make them work? And most importantly, who needs to make ICCs work? Is it somebody else who's going to come and do it for us? Or do we have to do it ourselves? So I thought the third bit could be around those sort of things. With that, let's jump right in. And now, Masoom, could I have the slide on what is sexual harassment? The next slide. Yeah. So according to the law, and this is an important bit because we really need to use the correct terminology when we are describing our experiences. Right? Otherwise, it won't have the impact that it's meant to have. So, what is sexual harassment? So, before 2013, our law did not even recognize organizational or workplace sexual harassment as a problem. It didn't even recognize it as a real thing. And that is why I think having this kind of a law is such a breakthrough for us, because now at least we know that what we are talking about is a real thing with real consequences, not something that we victims have just imagined, right? Or it's not something that we victims are just saying because we want to take revenge on people because we are crazy people. No. So now at least there's a recognition that it is a real thing, it has a real impact, and it is something that needs to be paid attention to. So let's look at each of these very quickly because they seem simple, deceptively simple. We just read them and say, oh, this is simple enough. I've understood it. But I think it requires a little bit of unpacking. So what are physical contact and advances? So this is all those unsolicited physical, contacts or physical touch. It could even be things like standing too close to a person in an intimate or lecherous way. It could even be things like hitting someone on the ankle, shoulder, arm while correcting posture or while teaching a sport or a dance or during, yoga or physiotherapy. Right? It could be, if I were to take an example from the world of theater, it could be, forcing an actor to rehearse a sexual scene or sexual content outside of scheduled or planned rehearsal. Right? It could also be about improvising sexual content last minute without taking expressed and clear consent from another actor. It could even be things like imposing yourself, landing up at somebody's house uninvited and refusing to leave, and this person is feeling threatened and uncomfortable because, maybe nobody is at home at that time, or that person is not ready to, have guests at that time, is not dressed in a way that he or she is ready to receive guests. So even that could be physical contact or advances. Remember, there's a word advance. I urge you to read each word carefully. It's not only contact, it's advance. So even moving towards someone, advancing towards someone with a lecherous or sexual look in your eye, in your eyes, without even actually touching a person, could come under this, this first point. Right? Let's move to a demand or request for sexual favors. Now, these could be subtle, these could be overt. So these are typically requests for, as it says, sexual favors or physical intimacy. Calling someone home to a secluded place, akele mein aake miliye mujhe, come after 6 p.m. So inviting someone at a time when nobody else is going to be around and you can kind of corner this person. It could be explicit that, I really like you, and if my desire merges with your art form, it's going to be, so it could be said in very beautiful ways. So just because we make these requests or demands in a very philosophical, beautiful way, using atma, paramatma, whatever else, that doesn't mean that it is not sexual harassment. आप बेहद नजाकत के साथ भी कुछ कहें, बहुत पोइट्री लगा के भी कुछ कहें, it could still be sexual harassment if it makes the other person uncomfortable. Right? So we are not in a competition of how arty you are or how creative you are with something like that. So now these things can happen between two people where there is no power differential. And I've handled many such cases, and those cases are far less complex to unpack and to work on. But when there is an asymmetrical power balance, and especially when these demands or even very polite requests in beautiful language, when they include or imply promises or rewards for complying, or threats or punishment or retaliation for refusing, and when there is a give and take element to it, right, which may be explicit and or which may be implicit, nobody may say it, but if you sense that, okay, if I say no to this, I'm not going to be able to perform in this play or perform in this festival, those things could be very, very complicated, and they are also part of sexual harassment, right? So that's when we look at things like, is there space to say no, right? Are there mechanisms where how we allow people to disagree, to dissent? And we have to look at things like, what are the consequences of saying no? So if the consequences of saying no to a teacher who is trying to make lewd advances at you is that you will not get the gold medal, then that very well could be sexual harassment, right? So please remember, sexual harassment is a powered offense, right? It is about abuse of power and authority. It has much less to do with lust, desire, sex, right? It has much more to do with entitlement and power play, right? So that is what sexual harassment is about. A lot of us think it's about love and desire. Not really. So let's come to sexually colored remarks. So now what are these? So there's a huge variety here as well that I have seen in the various complaints and cases that I have either directly or indirectly investigated. So it could be comments on clothes, body part, age. Oh, you're growing too old, you should get married before you're this age, you should do this before that age. Physical characteristics. Oh, you're too dark, if you were two shades fairer you would be prettier, right? So comments like that. Any gendered comments or any of that double meaning talk, with overtones and undertones. Even character assassinating, calling a person, slut shaming a person, or commenting about a person's sex or sexuality or sexual preference, gossiping about people, any unwelcome inquiries about somebody's sexual life, right? So that could also be, are you a virgin? And, those sort of questions could also come under sexually colored remarks. A lot of times, what one person sees as harmless flirting, oh, I was just, it was just flirting, could be received as something very different by the person who's on the receiving end. So remember one thing that this law, remember another thing that this law is clearly about the impact of something. So it's not so much about the intention of the person who's harassing, it is about the impact that it has on the recipient. Showing porn seems pretty straightforward, but it doesn't only include what we define as porn. Could also include any sexually explicit text, WhatsApp message, image, talking about sex in very graphic ways, describing your own sexual prowess and how good you are at it or whatever. Those could also come under this fourth category. Of course, every case is different and every case has to be looked at sharply and closely, but sometimes it could. The last one is interesting because it says that if the harassment doesn't come under any of those first four categories, it could be anything else which is unwelcome. It could be physical. I think physical, verbal, we've already covered. Non-verbal, I'm sure you all know, could be things like staring, winking, making gestures without using words, right? So all these things in an organizational context come under workplace sexual harassment, and and each of these things could be done in an explicit way, and it could be done in a very jalebi jaise goal implicit way. Irrespective of how it's done, it could come under sexual harassment. Let's move to the next slide, which will just create a space for us, an image for us to talk about the environment, the environmental aspects. So this is about not acts that target a particular individual, but this talks about environments where there is pervasive sexism. तो जैसे हिंदी में बोलेंगे ना कि वातावरण में ही सेक्सिज्म घुली हुई है. हवा, जिस हवा में हम सांस लेते हैं, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink has sexism in it, right? So these include those verbal, non-verbal behaviors that convey hostility, objectification of members of one gender, those environments which expect blind obedience. So a typical indicator of such an environment would be thankful that you got the opportunity to work with so and so. Be thankful you got a chance to perform with so and so, right? It could also be things like expectations of heteronormativity. Men should look like this, women should look like that. You dance like a woman, be more manly in your steps. What kind of a man are you? Women should look more submissive, right? Women should look like this. So an environment which has, this whole binary of very stereotypical thinking, where you have this black and white binary kind of thinking, could be environments which come under this category of hostile, intimidating, offensive work environments. Also environments where there's ultra competition, this very unhealthy, dirty competition, where you will do anything to get a particular project or a particular role, right? So environments could cover whole spectrums of sexual misconduct, right from awkward, mildly offensive remarks like somebody's clothes, body, or hold somebody's hand suddenly. Well, many people may not find that mild. Some may find that mild, and that's another thing, that everybody's sense of what is worse could be very different. So we have to go with what the victim thinks and what she finds or what he finds offensive, more offensive or less offensive. Right? So it could move from those sort of things to more offensive, where you talk to people in a superior manner, you are arrogant, you're entitled, you have to hear things like, don't you know who I know, and don't you know where my reach is, and those sort of threatening things, to highly offensive. It could be intentionally insulting people, um, you know, hostility and crude and coercive treatment. So let me just look at some questions as they're coming along. Great question. Who has the onus of proof? So unlike the legal mechanisms, the onus of proof in an inquiry under the ICC does not lie on the victim, does not lie on the complainant. It lies on the person against whom the complaint is made, right? That it is for that person to prove whether this happened or this did not happen. I mean, that person has to provide evidence along those lines. Okay. So let's move on. I think some of the questions you're asking will be answered as we go along. If not, we have a specific, we have a specific time allocated for Q&A. So let's move to the next slide, please, Masoom. From environment, let's move to ethics and values. And let's specifically talk about ethical misconducts, which are not covered by the law, right? We need to open our minds to having an ethics-based approach, not only a legal approach, right? We tend to think that ethical problems should only be taken seriously when they become a legal issue. What about incivilities and indignities that we observe in our workspaces on a daily basis, like authoritativeness, arrogance, entitlement, microaggression, power play, manipulation, bullying, right? What about humiliation from, let's say, a female guru? Humiliation and harassment of men, homosexual men, gender non-binary men, gender fluid people, same-sex harassment of a non-sexual nature. What about those? So we need to think a lot about the way people in power, and these could be directors, organizers, gurus, sponsors, festival managers. We need to think about ways in which they use or sometimes misuse their power over individual artists or individual performers, right? There are many, many ways other than sexual in which people abuse others. Could be financial, could be emotional, it could be insulting somebody publicly, could be shaming them. I don't know if this is true of the performing arts world, because I'm not from that world. But what I've seen in the sports world in a few cases that I've handled there is that there's this tendency to mentally torture students in the name of discipline, right? Imposing physically and mentally abusive training regimes on them and saying things like, we have to break you in order to make you, and what we are doing is good for you. Swallow your tears. Don't you dare cry, right? So, I mean, I don't know if this is true for your world. If it is, then that's perhaps another thing that we need to look into. But this sort of behavior creates a very, very fertile ground for sexual predators who can very cleverly take advantage of the highly disempowering and oppressive environment where abuse is already happening. You already have a large number of people who are groomed, who are ready, who are prepped up for abuse. They're ready. They're just, you can just pounce on them and you can just go ahead with it very smoothly. Often it's not only one kind. I mean, for academic purposes, we segregate mental, emotional abuse, but it's usually in real life not one kind of abuse. It's a combination of physical, mental, emotional, financial, and it hits you like a flood. It hits you like a tsunami. You are left incapable of processing or even registering it as registering it as abuse or harassment. You have been gaslit for so long that you don't trust anyone, not even yourself. So in a strange kind of way, you have become addicted to abuse. It is what we call in psychology a trauma bond, right? Which occurs, as I said, when there is a power imbalance in a relationship. So there will be intermittent good and bad treatment. It always won't be abusive treatment. It will be interspersed with very good loving treatment as well. And to survive, the victim starts forming an addictive attachment to his or her abuser. So I'm noting all your questions about ICCs. We will come to them. I told you there are 3 parts to this talk. We are still on part 2. So we will come to the ICCs for sure, right? So those who grew up in these abusive environments or in abusive homes are more susceptible to becoming trauma bonded to manipulative people in their adulthood. To complicate things further, you also have high respect for your abuser. So you start saying yes to all their requests. You start agreeing with their views, with their opinions, right? You may not want to let go of a teacher or a director who knows so much and who's so respected because you love your art. You've already invested a lot of time, effort, commitment, money, so now you don't want to lose that all, right? So this is how you continue to stay vulnerable. You continue to stay emotionally unsafe. And because you're emotionally unsafe, people start violating your boundaries. And then a wall gets created between you and your support system. And your abusers and even other enablers around may start using your insecurities or your past mistakes to shame you and make it even worse. As if this were not enough, there could also be a complication that is caused by the fact that your guru or the director that you're working under is a charismatic cult figure. The world literally worships this person. This person is celebrated in the industry, right? And you start deriving your sense of self from this association with this person, right? So different people respond differently to what we call these codependencies. See, some of us turn into overachievers when we are confronted with this kind of an abusive environment. We start overly depending on external validation, achievements, awards, rewards, scholarships. Some of us turn into loners. We shrink ourselves. We remain unseen. we diminish ourselves due to fear, due to public humiliation, or we start falling very unwell, we fall sick, we leave, we leave that particular, that particular profession or that particular space. Some of us turn self-righteous. So in order to get validation, we attempt to be right at all costs, right? So I will not confess to my mistakes. I will not confess to my guru's fault. So you kind of become the guru's chamcha or chamchi or khabri, and you start actually, becoming the right hand man or right hand woman or whatever of the abuser. So here is where your answers lie to why does no one speak up? How come no one is coming forward to support the victim? So just yesterday, a woman asked me this question: how can a woman support a person like this? And why is nobody saying anything, even though we all know that this is true? We've all known that this is the truth for 30 years. So the answer is because we are all trauma bonded, right? If we admit that this particular person is abusive, our entire worldview will crash. Our entire self-image will be delegitimized, right? And we will really have to start asking ourselves some very tough questions. And that is why a lot of us are fearful about speaking up, right? Often victims who have so-called submitted or consented, right, to sexual advances have been groomed, have been manipulated over several years. They have been prepped, they have been prepared, and they don't even realize that this is happening to them. So this topic is very, very complex and has to be approached with all the compassion and sensitivity we have inside us. And if we don't have it, we have to build that sensitivity inside us, right? Instead of responding like, she could have said this, she could have done that. Yes, maybe she could have said that. Maybe she should have done that. I am sure she realizes that too. But the fact is, the truth is, she was unable to, right? She was not able to do that. And what she should have done, or what she could have done, or what you would have done, or what I would have done, and how brilliantly we would have evaded the sexual offender is information that definitely has relevance, right? It's important because we can build some strategies using that experience. But when things like that are said in response to somebody sharing their traumatic experience where they have been unable to put a stop to it because they've frozen, they felt incapacitated. When we say things like this in response to that, I think that is nothing but cruel. And we really have to look inwards if we, if we respond in that way to people when they're sharing, their stories of abuse. But you are flirtatious, you dress like that, right? So that is clearly victim blaming. And maybe we don't want solutions that have worked for my generation. Taking sister along, taking friend along so that the guy doesn't grope you, inventing a boyfriend, inventing a fiance. Maybe we don't want to use strategies like that to save ourselves from being groped. Right. And maybe after all, these strategies have not been very effective because, obviously they haven't worked. Obviously, this is still an issue. So maybe those strategies of my generation and of yesteryears, maybe it's about time that we, say farewell to them. And maybe it is about time that we confront these issues in a little more frontal way and a little more direct way. And by direct, I do not mean adversarial. I do not mean that we should become bloodthirsty and revengeful. What I mean by direct is by making systemic changes, by changing our own mindsets, by working on our own values and ethics, not performatively, but genuinely. Young people in theater and film often tell me that they have worked with very woke directors, people who talk about very progressive feminist content. They write about gender equality, but they treat their cast and crew very unequally. So it's not just about the Guru Shishya Parampara. even in the garb of feminism, even in the garb of modernity, we continue to exploit each other, right? Sometimes it may be disguised as Guru Shishya Parampara. Sometimes it may be, disguised as modernity, as feminism. But that same ugly mindset is something that seems to be dominating. So if we have a culture in which we view people solely as instruments to be used for our own advancement, we need to fix that first. So I have a few questions for you. Do we have a culture that glorifies a me first ethic? Do we have a culture where we worship celebrities like demigods? I've noticed very often that there's this subclinical variety of narcissistic behaviors that are very common in the people who live and work around us. So these are people who are driven by dreams of glory. They have grandiose illusions or other delusions about themselves, right? They're indifferent to the needs of others. So the key question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do we build more empathy? How do we make people open to reality checks? How do we build a culture where constructive feedback to somebody, even somebody very senior to you, or even to a celebrity, is not perceived as an attack, but is perceived as something which is very valuable, right? How do we deal with our craving for limelight, our craving for applause? Because if you have many people, many people like this, it turns into some sort of a collective narcissism, which is extremely poisonous and very hard to deal with. Another problem area I see in the field of education, and that may apply to to the performing arts world as well, is this blanket respect for elders. I mean, just because we have lived for so long and we have white hair, that doesn't mean that we deserve blind obedience, right? In fact, I mean, if you think about it, even our epics and traditions teach us to question, teach us to constantly seek and ask, not to just keep receiving things blindly without applying our own thinking, without being curious. I mean, think of Arjun at the battlefield. He suddenly says, "Hey, I can't do this. I'm not going to do this." Right? And not a God-like person. God himself had to convince his student, convince his disciple to do something. And if Arjun had not questioned, we wouldn't have had the Bhagavad Gita, right? So parampara is not about status quo. So an ethical elder or an ethical guru, an ethical parent would encourage his or her students or children to read and interpret for themselves, to understand dharma, understand karma for themselves. Not be that I know it all, respect each word that I utter, right? So these are things that we also have to, very deeply think about. Let's jump, and worried about time. So let's jump now to legalities and some of the questions you've been asking about ICCs and so on. So may we have the next slide, please, Masoom? So this slide lists out only some. There are many more. I've listed only some of the duties of employers, sponsors, management. The 2013 POSH Act very clearly places the accountability at the highest levels. It is their duty to form an internal complaints committee. It is their duty to ensure that the investigation happens in a thorough manner. The committee is not supposed to be formed after a complaint comes in, because then when will you train that committee? Leaving an untrained committee, which you have just quickly constituted with your own brothers, sisters, relatives, enablers, with spineless, subservient people, with people who are victim blamers, who've not gone through hours and hours of training on this and hours of consciousness raising, and people who nobody trusts. And people who themselves haven't unresolved, themselves are carrying this unresolved grief on their shoulders and haven't been able to overcome that, how are they going to be able to, conduct an investigation, right? So when we create ICCs in a hurry in this manner, the intention is clearly obvious. The intention is not to solve the problem. The intention is to enable and to protect the harassers and to protect the perpetrators. It is a facade. I'd much rather have organizations which say that we are not going to do any of this, we are not going to put any of this in place, as compared to organizations that are doing this just for the sake of doing this, right? So it is, if you do this, you need to do it well. By law, awareness workshops need to be conducted annually for everyone. And for internal complaints committees, a proper capacity building training has to be done for them and for senior executives and for managements and organizers, right? Which will cover investigation techniques and all sorts of tools that we use when analyzing a situation or a complaint that has come to us. A policy has to be put in place, notices have to be put, awareness posters have to be put, that if you are feeling harassed, if there is something, some organizations go several steps ahead of the law, right? And they will write things like, even if you feel that there is something that you need to share, that that is bothering you, even if it is not sexual harassment, even if you're unsure whether it is sexual harassment or not, because remember, every sexual harassment situation begins with doubt, even in the eyes of the victim. Is it? Is it not? Am I over imagining? Am I crazy? Every victim, and I've met hundreds, started with that place of doubt. So you may very well meet a complainant who may say, I'm not even sure what this is. And it still could be sexual harassment, right? So people have posters where they've written, even if you are unsure, reach out to us, come talk to us, right? So this is about not just having a poster checklist. Okay, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've formed some sort of a committee. So create an ethos where reporting abuse and reporting red flags is welcomed rather than questioned or avoided. So the first meeting that you have with the complainant is so important, because how you treat her or him in that meeting really shows us, whether you really want to work on this or whether you want to just finish this off and continue avoiding it and continue turning a blind eye against it. So none of this is easy stuff. It's very easy to just do this at surface level, but if you want to do it in real terms, it's not that easy, right? This law, the 2013 Act, allows even an observer to complain. So for instance, if somebody is harassing me and humiliating me and I am not able to complain about it, another person can go and complain to the internal complaints committee. So what is the law? Let's forget the legalities. What is the spirit of such a law? What is it trying to tell you? Have each other's back. Stand up for each other. Today it is her or him. Tomorrow it could be you. So speak up now. Very different from the kind of messaging that we have been getting so far, which is you only have your back. Just look at yourself, just bother about yourself, don't bother about others. So in a way, this 2013 Act is trying to create a mindset shift in the way we think about work environments, right? So environments which caution people, don't speak up, nuksan tumhara hi hoga, don't speak up, you're the one who's going to be blamed. So those sort of environments is what we need to change, not just put mechanisms without working on the environment. The law clearly says that it is the duty of employers to provide a safe environment, to provide an environment where there is no adverse impact of complaining, where a grievance or somebody's feedback is not looked at like a grudge, but is looked at as feedback, which is very, very valuable. Right? So providing a safe, non-hostile environment is the duty of every organizer, every sponsor, every management, every employer, every whoever, every guru. Right? May we move to the next slide, please, Masoom? Yeah, so here are some, let me look at how we are doing with time. Okay, I'll wrap up soon. So here are some redressal mechanisms. So every victim has the right, every complainant has the right to go to the police. The good news is that in 2013, the IPC, or the Indian Penal Code, was amended, and those 5 definitions of sexual harassment, which I shared with you at the beginning of this talk, are the way it is defined. Sexual harassment is defined in the IPC as well. So one can go to the police, and we have a recent example of that. The Kathak Kendra complainant, I hear from you all, has gone to the police. Right, so that is one option. And a complainant can use all options, right? So she can go to the police and an internal complaints committee and a local complaints committee. And I'm going to come to what these are. So an internal complaints committee and a local complaints committee are alternative redressal mechanisms. These are redressal mechanisms which don't involve lawyers or the law enforcing bodies. Internal complaints committees are something that every organization, whether formal or informal, I keep hearing this, that we are an informal space. The law clearly says every educational institution, every business that runs from or every work, every kind of work that runs, even that might be even running from a home, right, comes under this, is covered by this law. So for every kind of organization which has more than 10 employees or more than 10, even the word employees, I urge you to go and read the law. Employees is defined in a very expanded sense. It includes students, it includes freelancers who you will partner with in the coming year. So you have to sort of make a guess. So I work with film production houses. They make a guess that, okay, this year we may be releasing 3 films. We are likely to work with so-and-so music director. We are likely to work with, these production houses. So let's have a session and let's create an IC, keeping all those things in mind. And that IC can, work for that 18-month or 12-month duration. So the law tells you that create ICs according to your administrative and geographic units. The law is a standard. Obviously, the law is not going to enumerate each and everything. Those things we have to work on ourselves, right? We have to map that how will the spirit of this law be applied in our kind of workplace. That is not something that will be done by the law for us, right? So according to the 2013 Act, there are not only internal complaints committees, which have to be formed by organizations and by people who work together, but the state has a responsibility too. So every district has to have a local complaints committee. So in case your organization does not have an ICC, or you don't trust the ICC of your organization, other than having the option of the police, you also have the option of the local complaints committee. And since Cree and Beej have told me that they're going to be creating resources for all of us, one resource that they should create is also the contact details, names of the local complaints committee members of various districts. So that is another redressal mechanism which is alternative. No, the LCC is not industry specific. The only thing that's industry specific or potentially industry specific is your internal complaints committee. And even there, one member, the external member, should ideally not be someone who is too entrenched in the politics and in the power play and in the power dynamics of your industry. So a lot of people, for instance, they intentionally select an external member who is not from that industry, because that person will give what he or she is supposed to give a third party neutral view. Because if I'm your external ICC member and I have a daughter who's an aspiring dancer and there's a charge against a guru who is on the selection committee of, giving her some award, how motivated will I be to, conduct a very, very ethical, will I be compromised here? I may not be, but I may be, right? So those are the things that one has to think about when forming internal complaints committees, right? So these are the three options. Of course, other than these three options, we have social media. And you might ask me, will these three options give me closure? Maybe not, right? So maybe in addition to these three options, we have to have things like healing circles. We have to do other things, because in any case, in an internal complaints committee, we can only address complaints of sexual harassment which happened in the last 3 months. The internal complaints committee and the local complaints committee have the power to extend that 3 months by another 3 months if the reasons are valid, and those reasons have to be documented and justified and explained. Right? So it can be 3+3, but a maximum of 6 months is what the ICC can take. So those of us who have unresolved trauma and have faced sexual harassment 10 years ago, or when we were 15 years old, or 16 years old, or 20 years old, there obviously have to be other mechanisms and other forums to deal with those. So if you ask me, are these inadequate? In a way, they are not inadequate, because these are great measures. I'm getting a very positive feeling about the police. We've done a lot of training for them. They've started recognizing even verbal abuse and non-verbal abuse as abuse. So the police is changing their mindset, and is doing well. Local complaints committees are also gradually becoming very, very active. The Gurugram Local Complaints Committee is one that has taken very, very important steps. Very recently, there was a person who complained against a very senior guy in a travel agency. The committee found him guilty. He had to give monetary compensation to the complainant for 11 lakh rupees. The LCC gave that to sort of a action, and that action was taken. So the realization that sexual harassment is costly. Those of us who face sexual harassment for many, many years fall sick more often. We lose career opportunities. We need expensive medical treatment, right? The committee does not have to commit a report, does not have to submit a report every 3 months. They have to submit a report annually to the district authorities and to the employer of their organizations, right? So there is an annual report, and that report doesn't include any details of the complaint. The complainant's name, the respondent's name is 100% confidential. None of this comes out in media. It should not be coming out in media. At a general level, things can come out in the media that, okay, over the last 6 months, there are these 3 cases that came, and based on these 3 cases, here are some measures we are taking, and here are some, training programs we are arranging. So at a general aggregated level, some things can be shared, but no specifics. Right? So here, I thought this is what I'd share with you about redressal mechanisms. The last slide, please. Yeah, so when we say, I just want you to think about this, and this is a slightly bitter pill for all of us to swallow maybe. But when we say ICCs are failing, or ICCs are not effective for us because we are informal, and believe me, those companies who you define as formal, even they thought that the ICC does not apply to them. They had a bunch of reasons for not implementing this. So throughout 2014 and 2015, we had to work very hard to convince even typical office spaces on why they should be having ICCs. Even they didn't accept this with love and compassion and without resistance, right? So when we say ICCs are failing, who is actually failing? The presiding officer of the ICC is a senior woman from our space, from our industry. The members, barring one member, the external member, are capable, credible professionals and leaders from your industry, right? From your organization. The external member is a third party member with experience in organizational sexual harassment prevention and remediation, who is selected by you. So that's the thought I want to leave you with, that if ICCs are not working, right? If we go back to the previous slide again, Masoom, sorry, I'm a very non-linear person, right? So yeah, so ICCs are formed by us. They are the only out of the three places, spaces mentioned here where we can have a say, where we can create innovative ways of wrapping our arms around an issue, where we can come up with creative, innovative solutions, where we can call the shots, where we can be really thoughtful, really compassionate, where we can think about what restorative justice looks like, where we can think about how to, you know, how to coach, counsel people, what sort of leadership interventions should we have? Should we have training around how to be assertive for young people who join this industry? So this is your space. You can be creative, you can do marvelous things. And if we keep complaining that they're not working, the next step which I see happening, in fact it might happen very soon, is that internal complaint committees will be removed, and then we will have a form of a local complaints committee which might, yes. So the law, there's a question that can the number of members in committees be extended? Of course. The law says you have to have a minimum of 4. The law does not say that you cannot have 20. Right? So please don't over rely on the law. The law is only giving you the basic minimum. Law आपको ढांचा दे रहा है कि यार इतना तो कर लो. Just do this at least. Who is stopping us from doing more than that? Who is stopping us from having another committee which looks at complaints from non-women, right? Which looks at complaints from men, from LGBTQ persons, right? Who is stopping you? Who has tied our hands is what I'm asking. Nobody has tied our hands. The law has only given you the bare minimum that you should be doing. So please start with that, but don't end with that. Just use that as a starting point. Yeah, use that as a toehold and move forward and do all the things that we need to do and take everyone along. There is power in solidarity. There is power in, doing this collectively with a lot of love and compassion. I would say even love and compassion for harassers, even love and compassion for those who have wronged us. Because, the ICC is not about bloodthirst. The ICC is not about ostracizing people. The ICC is about protecting others from future harm and is about helping the complainant come to terms with what has happened and being fair to her and helping her or him or them to move on. So procedures cannot be answered here. So there are several procedures that are there. And then there are several places where there are no procedures. You have authority to create your own procedures. That would take at least a day-long training. And so if you all decide who wants to join the ICC, we'll run you through a sort of an eligibility criteria. Right? So yeah, so the question is, who can form? Anybody, you tell me who can form. People are doing it so creatively. I would say your IIC, what is it? Your India International Center, India Habitat Center, NCPA, Kala Ghoda, people who, give out their venues to you, they should definitely have it. Any organization which has, which takes money or has, commercials attached to it should definitely create it. 3 or 4 of you, if you have small creative spaces and not huge funds, 3 or 4 of you can come together and form one ICC. You can say, okay, ICC is not working for us. Let's strengthen the LCC. Let's put in somebody who represents us in the LCC. I mean, let's sit together one day and have a brainstorming sessions on what are your exact specificities and peculiarities of your industry. I am sure if even 10 of us come together, we will be able to find ways of making this work, right? So, but if we don't even come together and have that conversation, it is definitely not going to work. So there are ways of making it work. I am the external members in 2 film festival ICCs. Those committees are formed for a short duration, for 5 days, while that film festival happens. But we are trained before that. We are ready. The ICC is ready. And then it's like a pool of people who are trained to do this. And then you can call upon them at any point of time for your needs. So I'll just stop here. I'm so sorry. I've hogged a lot of time. And I'd like to hand over to our panelists who will, who will help us, respond to some of these things.
Thank you so much, Asya, for that very insightful, informative session. Before we move on to a discussion with the participants here, we will just ask a few of our panelists today to just respond to Asya if they have any thoughts. Can we begin with Sanjukta?
Firstly, thank you all so much for being here and for taking all this in. It is not it's not an easy thing to listen to. And that's possibly because we recognize so many of these patterns in what we have previously or what we have heard of. But I really think that the onus of the burden has to shift from the student, from the young artist, the actor, the dancer, to a collective, to all of us who need to hold this space, to teach. I also speak as a teacher. There was a question in the chat saying, should I now not correct body posture? Should I now not make nuanced corrections in the Abhinaya? But I would say, of course you should, but you should allow your student to call you out. You should allow your student to say, hey, I'm uncomfortable, could you tell me privately, or could you not tell me in front of the whole group? I think if we have this kind of a more egalitarian and open student-teacher relationship, it can really go a long way. Also thinking about the whole deification that happens, not just in the Guru Shishya Parampara, but also about in spaces of perhaps democratic situations in which a male genius director is also glorified. For example, if you've got a scholarship and into an institution that you really wanted to get into, or you've had an audition that you've been chosen, and there you have to really face a hostile environment every day, you start lying to yourself, and I speak from personal experience. This has happened to me. You start lying to yourself, you blind yourself to certain injustices, allow yourself to witness hostilities just because you think this is not, these are small hurdles in the larger goal. But I think all of us need to be very sensitive, and there was this there's this conversation I'm having with friends in theatre, and I know Yuki and Tushar are here from that group. And there was a charter that was drafted by the Chicago people in theatre, doing theatre in Chicago, where they drafted a charter with safe practices in rehearsal rooms, safe practices in classrooms. And a number of very informal theatre groups of even 3-4 people, 5 people joined together and signed this and said we pledge that we will follow these norms. And I think these are just little small steps possibly that we can take, but we need to, and I'm so glad that all of us are here to start these conversations in our own circle, because I really see this as a collective movement. And we also should perhaps start questioning the content of how we perform and how we choose to bust certain stereotypes, about coyness and consent, and how we can give possibly our nayikas more agency when we perform. I'd like to now hand over to Geeta to respond. Geeta is a core Beej member, and she's also a sociologist.
I'm a sociologist and also core Beej member. Joking. So firstly, let me really congratulate both Beej and Cree Foundation for actually, continuing and opening up these conversations. I think those are very, very important conversations. I want to really thank Asya for doing a wonderful job of taking us through what is the problem and how do we sort of at least start tackling it in terms of its, in the mechanism, just once. Yeah. So, to actually, I have really just want to, I don't want to take too much time. I just want to pick on a couple of things that both Asya and Sanjukta spoke about. When we are dealing with the arts, because we are dealing with so-called extremely creative domains. And when we're talking about creativity, we often tend to talk about the blurring of boundaries, right? Between the real, the unreal, between the material, the non-material. We always talk about great works of art as out of breaking social norms, right? We think that art which conforms by social norms is really not that great art. Great art always challenges the social, which is true, right? We all know that it's extremely true that the purpose of art is actually to hold up mirrors to us, right? But in the process of doing art, very often what we see, what we witness, what this leads to is a very dangerous transgression of autonomy and, more importantly, justice. So very often we are asked this question, when you're doing this kind of thing for the performing arts, for the creative arts, even for us in the academics, are we policing? Have we started bringing a culture which is taking away the electric charge between the muse and the creator? Is it taking away the basic nature of art, which is to be able to transgress? Are we doing that? Well, these are difficult questions, and they need to be answered collectively from different communities, right? But I think the important thing to say here is that there is no effort to police. There is only an effort to make more just and fair working context where creativity of all is nurtured. So as Sanjukta pointed out, why do we live in cultures where the genius is glorified as the individual genius? Why do we live in worlds where the person is projected as the genius rather than the work? Why do we emphasize so much on individuals rather than on collectives? Suppose if we were to shift the focus of great work or great art or genius away from the individual into a more collective domain, could we democratize things further? Could we make spaces which are less prone to this kind of predator relationships? This is something that I want to flag off to you all, that maybe we should start thinking less about the individual genius of people, whether they are directors or whether they are artists or whether they are dancers, often male. Yeah. But when women also enter those spaces, they might be actually reproducing those cultures of patriarchy, of misogyny, of glorifying male genius, all of that. Yeah. So we need to collectively rethink that. We need to collectively rethink this idea that art transcends everything. Can we start looking at art as something much more, something that is produced within context and within the respect of socio-cultural context and spaces? If we start producing that, probably we will have much more democratic cultures. Yeah, this is what I personally feel. I think, the kind of forms that we, even the modern forms, the classical Indian dances might have a very ancient history. We all know about that, but they've been reinvented in modern times. They've been reinvented in the modern Indian Renaissance to sort of bring in more hybrid spaces from the West and from older traditions and practices. But what we need to do is carefully look at the kind of, technically the term that probably we need to, introduce in our understanding of the performing arts and the classical arts, is how they are dominated by a certain Brahmanical patriarchy, which we need to really start asking and questioning, that why is it that these forms are so gated? Yeah, in the classical forms, why are they so gated? Why are they only a certain caste group that gets to perform these? How do we bring in more secular understandings of themes? Yeah, how do we look at our gods and goddesses in a much more human way? Can we present them in a much more human way, much more relatable way? Yeah, how do we understand that in our cultures, we are reproducing gender hierarchies. We are reproducing social relationships. When we present the Naika in a particular way, when we present the actress in a particular way, we tend to reproduce gender stereotypes. The purpose of art, which we claim is to break stereotypes, actually lands up reproducing a lot of stereotypes, both sometimes in the content and sometimes in the practice. As Asya was saying, that sometimes it's very woke and feminist people who also, don't know where to draw the line, don't know what the meaning of consent is. And we need to pay attention to that, because what we are going in is, of course, a very, complex culture with the hold of tradition and the hold of modernity, both simultaneously working. So very often, for example, we tend to hear is that, especially maybe in the film industry, maybe it's happening a lot in the academia, I can tell you for sure, that is that if the girls are so liberated, if they are so sex positive, then why do they have a problem? Yeah, but the question here, as Asya was also trying to say again and again, is even the law honors that, is the subjectivity of a gesture. Yeah. If a woman, if a girl is sex positive and she believes in her own agency and her liberation, does not mean anything goes, does not mean that everything is okay. She has the right to say no when she wants to. This is a culture that somehow we don't internalize, and we need to take the men along, because the kind of toxic masculinity that we see, or the kind of benevolent masculinity that we see in our arts also is needs to be re-examined and re-understood for us to have more gender just spaces. Yeah. So that's really what I wanted to add, my 2-bit for the moment. We'll see what happens in the question answers.
Thank you, Geeta.
Who goes next? I don't know.
Would Arshia Sethi, founder at 3, I think, would like to respond. Over to you, Ashia. You are on mute.
I see that. Thank you so much for bringing me on, Masoom. I'd like to begin by thanking everybody for participating in such large numbers and for staying till the end. I want to thank Asia for doing an excellent job. It's amazing how much you've been able to pack into this short session. I want to thank Beej for being excellent partners and even pushing me in that partnership to rise above my previous established capacities. And of course, I thank everybody who has worked on these issues before. Now, I don't know whether I'm still supposed to come on in the end to do a round up kind of a thing, or is this it? But if I were to base myself on what Asya has said and what Sanjukta said, and finally what Geeta said, and the many questions that I have been reading in the chat box for the moment, what I would like to say is that I remember life very clearly before 2013. I remember the complete doubt that was on the individual whose voice ever got raised. So individuals would not raise their voice every time there was abuse that they faced. And in the arts, because of its unstructured and informal ways of training, violence was a regular part. I have been slapped by my guru for getting something wrong. It's okay, gone past that moment, but it's something that I remember very clearly. I was already doing some gender trainings by 2013. So when the act came, it gave this thrill about how we could take things forward in a more positive manner. Amongst the first set of trainings I got to do was with the policemen of the northern states of Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, and Delhi. It was a horror story. Not one of them believed that women had agency. Not one of them believed that truth was the natural sort of path that people choose. It was assumed that they were lying. It was assumed. So the proof for many years, even after the law, remained on women and those who were victims of abuse. Fortunately, the recent incident that has been referred to earlier at the Katha Kendra, where the young dance student went to the police and their prompt reaction tells me that something must have shifted there too. I haven't done a training with the police for at least 3 years now, so excuse me, but I don't remember noticing that shift till this incident happened. But we do not need to do something so dramatic. The law permits so many other ways of dealing with conflict before it grows into something horrific. The ICCs are one way. Listening circles, hearing circles, and healing circles are another way. Um, my earlier social development work was in the use of drugs and its link with HIV. So I was working on prevention a lot. Catching early signs was a very important aspect. So if you have hearing, listening circles, if you have healing circles where there is sharing that happens in a respectful environment, it helps the community at large to plot trends and identify early signs of abuse. And these can be addressed. As Asya says, as an observer of abuse, we can address those signs. I believe that most people are on different points of the spectrum, that the heart is in the right place, but are on different points in the activist or action-oriented spectrum. So the work actually is to shift more and more people to a more activist end. I also hope that sessions like this and the future sessions that Asya has hinted at of working to create future ICC members empowered, confident, knowing how to speak, knowing the law, knowing the vocabulary, very important. Otherwise, we can institutionally have these mechanisms, redressal mechanisms, but they could be populated by the wrong kind of people. Wrong kind of people. Very recently, 2 statements by the National Commission of Women have not been women friendly. And this is the highest body. So we need to be questioning, speaking out, being more alert, being forensic. And if we have to train ourselves to do all of this, I hope that we as a group will realize the importance and be available for that kind of training. I think in the end, as per our flow chart, I was supposed to say something about the way forward. I think I've hinted at the way forward here, but there are more specific things that I would like to talk about when I come towards the end, and I'm asked to do a session, a little section in the end. But for the minute, you was what Asya left it at. And really, we are the ones who need to work first on ourselves. Then we can hope for getting more and more people. But we are moving in the right direction. There is a critical point that we are reaching. We have the strength of numbers now, which wasn't there earlier. We have reached the tipping point of understanding. We just must keep this going. That's my last point that I would like to make now, and hand it over to the next person who is speaking. I don't.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Asya. Natalia Hillner would like to also respond. She's also here with us today. Natalia, over to you.
Hi, namaskar to everyone. Thank you so much for holding this space. Big congratulations to the organizers. I'm really quite touched that so many people have decided to show up and show that this is an issue that matters to them. I hope that it's just a beginning. So that it's interesting that art, one of the purposes of art, one of the main purposes of art, whatever field it be, has always been since the beginning of time to heal. If we are not healing, then what are we doing? And if we ourselves are not healed, then our wounds are going to show through the art that we create, and we won't be able to heal. So I wanted to, there's been so many wonderful points already made. Just to give a short context of, why I'm here, whatever, some people that I know are here. I've been a Kathak dancer my whole life. Now I just consider myself a dancer, a global dancer, but I actually shifted from dance to, I also do victim advocacy. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with, but I wanted to introduce you to, there are many rape crisis centers and abuse crisis centers all throughout India that can offer this type of help. I work for one here in the US, but a victim advocate essentially is a person, a support person that is there to basically support you emotionally, psychologically, also to speak for you if you feel that you cannot speak for yourself because you are so triggered, or as a victim, or you feel that you would be more empowered for somebody else to speak for you. So if you know a survivor, or if you are a survivor or victim, then just so you know, these resources are there for you. You can take an advocate, victim advocate with you to the police or to the court to feel more empowered, because sometimes we don't have the reason victim advocates exist. Thank goodness, is because sometimes family and friends aren't the first people that we go to. These are very sensitive issues, and sometimes maybe they're not equipped to be the best support person for us. So it helps to have an anonymous person to be there for you. So I believe that Masum will be sending a list of crisis centers in all the local regions and areas in India. So please, I hope that people use those, and they are meant specifically to support victims. I just wanted to touch upon two other subjects that have now become, something, one of my specialities on being able to educate on these issues in order to become more empowered communities. And I'm so happy that the dance community is also becoming more aware and empowered on these issues. And one of them is that there's only one person that can stop rape. And there's only one person that can prevent harassment, and that is the rapist or the harasser. So for so long, our culture has taught us that it is the responsibility of the victim to protect herself, himself, or themselves from rape or from harassment. It is their responsibility to protect themselves. But that is actually a very patriarchal and a very even illogical sort of reasoning, because the only person that is responsible and accountable for stopping the abuse is the abuser themselves. So that's just something for everyone to really sort of digest, because even myself as a victim, all of these are things that, it takes a long time to sort of imbibe into our new ethics. I love how the word ethics has popped up. And the other subjects I wanted to talk about is how do we support a victim? I get that question a lot. And there's many ways that you can support a victim, but the number one, I would say, your job, if you really truly care about this issue, is to believe the victim first and foremost. Just statistics wise, less than 2% of all testimonies are found to be false. So even though we shouldn't need these statistics, more than 98% of all testimonies of abuse are true. But regardless of the fact, as a human being, as a fellow empathetic person with a heart, one should believe first and foremost. Second of all, some things that one can say to support is, I believe you, I'm here for you. And actually, I want to say that to all of you, and that we can create a culture that says, I believe you, I'm here for you, I'm listening. How can I help you? How can I support you? Yeah. So these are just a few phrases that can really change the dynamic of how, if someone feels that they can trust you with their survivor story. And one mistake that we often make is we try to sort of save the victim and save the survivor and say, okay, come on, let's go to the police and, we're going to go and confront your abuser and we're going to do this. That actually can be more detrimental and can be more harmful because what you're doing is you're taking the power away from the victim. And the victim has already experienced that, because abuse is where is essentially that, is where someone steals your power, your voice away from you. And so you don't want to be another person that does that. You want to be a person that empowers the victim, gives power to the victim. And so you can say things like, how can I best support you? Whatever you need, right? And so you can present options like, oh, do you need to go, do you want me to, help you find a counselor? Do you need me to help you find a therapist? Do you need me to help you go make a report, police report? Or do you just want to talk about it? You just want to talk about it with me? And of course, confidentiality is very, very important when supporting victims. I guess there's so much more to be spoken about. Consent is a huge, huge subject. How to practice consent. There's so many resources online on how to really intelligently practice what consent is. I like to think of the 5 words. It's free, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Okay, so consent being free means it's equal power. Yeah, it's free means no blackmail, no pressure. Yeah. R is for reversible. So that means if a person is giving you consent, let's say, yes, I will come for the class, or, consent for anything, Reversible means they can then take away that consent. Just because they said yes doesn't mean that they have to stick to the yes, right? So what if when they come to the class, they feel uncomfortable, they have the right to say, no, I've decided not to come to the class anymore, yeah? And this can be for any situation. And then informed consent is obviously where there's very much explicit context given, right? Explicit there's no lies being told, and what type of consent is being taken to what is very stated very clearly. And then one that actually, one aspect of consent, which I don't think everywhere we're not aware of enough, and we don't talk about enough, is consent has to be enthusiastic. So a non-answer, or just if someone just doesn't say anything at all, that is a no, right? If you're going to give consent, it has to be an explicit yes and enthusiastic, in the sense, because sometimes depending on the person's personality, it's, people become very maybe intimidated, and it's hard for them to, they may freeze. And so in that moment of being frozen, that for you is a sign, reading the person's body language, okay, they're uncomfortable with this, so then that's a no. So anyway, these are subjects that there's plenty of information online. And I hope this is just
Thank you, Natalia, for sharing.
Thank you so much, Natalia. We will move on now to the Q&A session. So if somebody has a question, you can either type it on the chat, or if you could use the raise hand option, it will be at the bottom bar of your Zoom panel. There's an option called reaction. So you will have a raise hand there, and we can ask people. Oh, we already have a question. There's a question in the chat. As a student of dance, oh, sorry, that's just a comment. Yeah, there is a question. I think if somebody from the panel would like to take this. The question is, as a student of dance, I'm not really sure how to identify verbal abuse. Gurus shouting at students is quite often considered good for the growth of the student. So when do we know when a line has been crossed? Can we call it out? As a student, it seems very difficult for me.
Yeah, should I attempt to say something? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
so yeah, wonderfully complex question about a wonderfully complex situation. So yes, so I would say that the best thing to do is to have preventive measures in place, to have mechanisms in place, to have those contractual is an awful word, but for lack of better word, to have those contractual conversations that, hey, I'm going to be your teacher for the next 12 months. There'll be times when I'll do some things that'll upset you. There'll be times when you'll do some things that might upset me. And here is how we are going to have conversations. If it is something that you feel you can tell me in front of everyone, go ahead. And if I don't like it, then I'll give you feedback that next time, please tell me something like this in private. As simple as that. These are basic human qualities. These are basic conversations that we should have at the onset of any kind of relationship. Whether it is a romantic relationship, whether it's a work-related relationship, whether it's a teacher-student relationship, right? So that's what we were talking about, new ethics, new ways of starting relationships, new ways of ending relationships, new ways of handling rejections, right? New ways of stating what I'm comfortable with, what I'm not comfortable with. Unfortunately, we pretty much have to start with scratch because we don't seem to have any of this, or we don't seem to have ideas even around any of this, right? So it is, I mean, if you think about it, there are very simple solutions to such things. So what if we created those mechanisms that I am going to every week spend 15 minutes one-on-one time with each of my students. My student will decide what they want to cover in that 15 minutes. This is the work that I do with middle school and high school. So give every teacher a small amount of face of one-on-one time with each student every 15 days. I mean, you can decide the rhythm of it. And then also have a protocol for emergency. So if something happens in between these two, and you don't want to wait for those 15 days, then here is a way that you can best reach me if there's an emergency. And I will always respond to your WhatsApp message, or I will always respond to your call. That is a commitment I'm making. And I want that commitment from you, that when I ask you for something, right? So what if we started having conversations like these? And what if we started, creating spaces, creating time for these difficult conversations and making it easy? You see, a part of it is to blame others. Why didn't she tell me? Did I create the space for my child to give me feedback? Even as a parent, have I really created that space? Given the fact that the child is emotionally, financially, and in every other way dependent on me, right? Given the fact that, okay, I know my personality, I can sound controlling at times. Yeah. So know yourself, know what kind of space you occupy, know what kind of impact your body, your action, and come on, you all are artists. You understand these things way better than corporate executives, I'm 100% sure. I have to teach them all these things from scratch. You all are already so evolved. Right? So this is something that we can clearly do. Have a sort of a contract, have these rules in place, have a code of conduct in place. Some of it will be written, some of it will be said, some of it will be unsaid. But these are the things that will set the tone for what kind of relationships you have and what kind of interpersonal ethics you follow and what kind of energy and power and ethics you release, so you emit from your being.
Also, one thing I took from the Chicago Charter that they had implemented as rehearsal room practice is as soon as something, because sometimes we utter something insensitive without that intention. So if the person to whom it is directed or even someone witnessing it immediately says ouch, so that's the word, you just say ouch, and then the person who has uttered the word has to ask, why did you say ouch, and then they can say oops, I didn't mean that. Ouch and oops. So certain ways of just sexually oppressive language perhaps that we use, or something that can be nipped in the bud rather than us harboring it for too long, and just call out for a more egalitarian performance culture right there and then. That was one thing I wanted to add.
Thank you, Asya and Sanjukta. We have there are several questions in the chat, but before we move to that, there was a raised hand. Aranyani wants to ask a question. Aranyani, please unmute yourself.
Hi, I just want to thank you all for this wonderful session. And just when I was listening to Natalia talk about crisis centers and advocates. Did you say advocate? Yeah. It just occurred to me that I think one of the big issues in India is that victims don't trust institutions or crisis centers that are set up to support them. Because I mean, even and I mean, that's one thing. Even if I think people don't even know about them, but even if they did, like now when I heard you say that there are so many of these crisis centers, the first thing that occurred to me was, would I, pick up the phone and call one of them? And I think given, I mean, and I have to say this, I'm relatively sheltered in my upbringing. I'm privileged. I am, you know, come from a liberal background. I can go to my parents and tell them if I've been abused or anything like that. But even then, I don't know if I would actually go and speak to them because of the experiences that I have had, which I think a lot of Indian women have had. We've all been either sexually harassed or leered at or assaulted or something or the other. And I mean, even experience that I had where I did actually go to the police, I didn't ultimately, the whole thing came around to I mean, I don't know, I don't even know what happened, but ultimately I withdrew my complaint. So it didn't even get to that point where I could get to a support center or a crisis center or anything like that. So how would we address, I mean, I think that's also, and this is from me, somebody who has access to all of this, what would happen to women who don't have access to these things, or don't at all have even less trust in institutions and crisis centers than I do, because of their experiences, which might be much worse than mine. So how do we address things like that? How do we address trust in institutions and trust in support systems that are there for us? That was my question.
Yeah, so, very well said. I mean, I wonder if I would ever go to any of these institutions myself. Yes. So the hardest part of my work has actually been in the last few decades to take institutions along wherever possible, train ICCs, train LCCs, train the police, because we don't invest in this sort of consciousness raising training. You see, हम सब ने उसी कुएं का पानी पिया है, whether we are slightly privileged, slightly less privileged. We all have patriarchal thinking, which is really inside us. And we all ask these victim blaming questions. I remember the first inquiry I conducted, I'd be so ashamed of it today if somebody had recorded it and they played it back to me, because I was asking all those victim blaming questions. What were you doing at 10 p.m. there? Why didn't you do this? Why I would have just slapped him. Why didn't you slap him? Right? And then the more you see, the more you learn. And I must say that, I've read a lot of stuff written by academics, by people who worked on neuroplasticity, on how the brain works. And so you require all that evidence-based and research-based knowledge to equip you and help you go through this. And now, in the market, I don't know what other word to use, but in the ecosystem, there are a lot of people with this expertise. It's not only me. So we've gathered a lot of this expertise through lived experience by working on cases. So maybe we could create forums where some of us could start imparting this to others, because wherever police has been sensitized, they've done a remarkable job. Wherever ICCs have been sensitized, I'm part of about 20 ICCs as an external member. Out of them, 15 are those typical victim blaming kinds who've not really gone through that full consciousness raising training. But I'm proud to say that 5 of them are amazing. They've picked up on the job while talking to complainants, while contextualizing it, while reading feminist literature, by putting things within a feminist sociological framework. And that's where people like Geeta and others are so helpful to us. Right? So this snobbery we have that, oh, academics are like that. Oh, so-and-so is not an academic. So first we have to get rid of these snobberies that we have with each other. That my English is better and my this is better and my that is better. First we have to get rid of those bloody, problematic things. That, oh, so-and-so is not Indian, so-and-so is Indian, and so-and-so is a Lavani dancer, and this form is better, this form is more spiritual, and that form is... So first, let's get rid of that bullshit, right? And then we can actually start working, we can actually map out that, okay, we need counselors, right? One reason why I've never gone to a therapist is, as a feminist, I don't know if my therapist will have that same orientation. Or will my therapist give me advice like, oh no, you have to obey your husband and things like that? So that's my fear. I'm not going to go to a therapist who doesn't share, my kind of overall thinking, right? So we have to create those spaces where there is a feminist in interpretation. Egalitarian and feminist does not mean anti-men. The amount men have benefited from feminism and how much feminism has made men's lives better in so many ways, right? And that is something, this whole thing of you're the anti-male brigade. How can we be anti-male, right? How can we be anti anyone? Right? So this thinking about what feminism is, what we are, and again goes back to our values, our ethics. And values, excuse me, is not what we inherit from our lovely parents. However sweet and loving and all they are, they also are full of problems, and we have to develop our own, source of ethics, value systems. We have to take the best from them, and then we have to, interpret it in newer and better ways. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but yes, the situation is pathetic. There's nowhere where we can go to. So if there is one body where you have been given authority, which is the ICC, uska to kuch kar lo yaar. Out of all these bodies which are not equipped, there's one over which you have much more direct control. Make something out of that before that is snatched away from us, is my plea.
Thank you, Asya. I also just wanted to add a couple things. Aranyani, thank you for the great question. I unfortunately didn't have an opportunity to, I wasn't aware at that time while I was in India to reach out to crisis centers there. I am aware that they do exist, but as far as crisis centers, I think universally, they actually were born out of the feminist movement, because they saw that there was such insensitivity from all the institutions. So actually their job is to be completely not connected to the system if they're doing their job right. Yeah, and so I totally understand. Actually, the mistrust of systems and institutions happens here in the US too. I mean, we don't trust our government completely or our institutions. But what I'm saying is that I think that we are also, I think as women, we are conditioned to be very fearful of the world around us, because that's part of the rape culture, that, we have to always protect ourselves from potential perpetrators. But, it's time for us to actually see the amount of power that we have, and the world in and of itself is actually can be a safe place. And there's so many people out there that are working to support survivors.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Natalia, for your inputs as well. We are running a little short on time, and we have few questions. So to the participants, we might not be able to take all the questions, but we'll definitely make sure that we respond to you personally. I'm just going to ask you two very interesting questions that have come up, and I think we can possibly then close the session today. There is a question which I'm paraphrasing. There are sometimes unconscious biases against people from sexual minorities. And when such people because of the way they look or they act, and when such people sometimes raise these issues of abuse, there are high chances of gaslighting. How does one deal with that? If we can make this response short, and then maybe a detailed response, we can email this person later. Asya, Sanjukta, Geeta, anyone?
So, lovely question. And yes, we have to work towards this. First, we have to understand that what are the exact issues that people of alternate sexualities are facing. And we have to create our own mechanisms. The law is not there to help us here. And that is why this whole entirely law-based approach is so problematic to me. Of course, the law is there. It's great. I love it. I'm a great advocate of it. But there's so many things that the law doesn't cover, which we have to, I think we should start doing focus group discussions with people to understand what their issues are. It could be simple things like not having toilets for people who don't want to use either male or female toilets, right? So it could be so many. It could be from the smallest things which haven't even occurred to us, because we are coming from a place of privilege and because we are not in that situation, that we have to first understand. And with all our might, and by might I don't mean masculinity, I mean the nice compassionate might, we have to fight for any sort of discrimination and any sort of humiliation of any human being. So, a good starting place is to make it safer for women, but very soon we have to make it safer for any a person of any kind of minority.
Asu,
go ahead, please.
No. No, so I just wanted to say that it is not that it is first about women and then about gender non-conforming people. We have to deal with it simultaneously and together. And the important thing is it's not just about that. Like I was trying to say, it's also about film industry now. It's also about caste. It's also about what do you do, how do you work caste just politics into your practice, into the space. So it's about various marginalities. And I think gender non-conforming people, we see a lot of their presence, for example, in the creative arts. Yeah. And yet you see so much homophobia. Yeah. So for me, at least personally, what I feel is if you look at the history of the women's movement, if you look at the history of the POSH Act itself, right? Which we need to make it much more expanded to include boys, young boys who get abused by older men. We need to include gender non-conforming people within that. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that all this has been a consequence to a very large extent with the efforts of the women's movement. Yeah. With the collective efforts of the movement. So I think what happens is the creative arts and the classical arts think that movements are political and movements therefore are impure. We must not get into that. I think we need to strengthen the linkages with the queer movements, with the anti-caste movements, with the women's movements, in order that our art gets better informed and our practices actually become more just. So I would say it's a larger project that we need to build, yeah, for which I guess artists have to first start thinking that they are political beings, political not in the sense of a narrow political.
Very true, very true, very truly said that our issues are all intersectional and so should be our solutions. One last question. This is directed towards Geeta and Arshia Sethi, but please feel free to answer. How to deal with power play and unethical practices by renowned and elderly female guru?
Can I go first, Masoom? Yeah, Arshia?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so it's difficult. We all know none of this is easy, right? That's why I'm saying we need to work collectively. We need to work together. I want to only say that women gurus are as much a part of a patriarchal setup, a culture. Yeah, they tend to sort of imbibe the same culture, though they live in very different bodies, they live in very different conditions. We assume that they should become automatically more sensitive, more compassionate to other women. But sometimes when you have fought a struggle in a culture to come at a certain level, you've done it by playing that game rather than by contesting that game. You see this in the world of science, you see this in the world of government, you see this in the world of academia. Women on top of the hierarchy need not necessarily be compassionate or sensitive or, in my language, feminist. Yeah, they need not be. Right? Sometimes men can be more feminist, yeah, than women can. So I think it is important to call out the gurus. It's very important to do that, but I think it's important to do that collectively. And it's important to do that in a way that will constructively change the practice rather than targeting the guru personally. Okay, it's probably a wider conversation that you need to build with the guru for changing the practices. Yeah, so it's about educating. That's not easy, I know.
Yeah, I will just add to what Geeta has stated so eloquently and powerfully that I am troubled by one other character in the entire dramatis personae, and that is the female gatekeeper to iconic guru, maybe. Because her presence dulls your alertness, dulls your forensic nature, and misleads you, albeit momentarily. And because she is not really guru, so you don't know whether calling out is really the issue. But all these characters are troublesome characters. There is no one stroke, one size of definition that fits all. In the case of the women guru who sometimes appear as harassers, it is the fact that if they have reached the position of gurus, they had to play the politics of the men, and play every kind of exclusionary politics to be able to reach that position. So they've sort of forgotten the uh, the compassion part of it. They've become roughed up to such an extent that they often forget the compassion part of it. So it's not easy. I reiterate what Geeta said. It is bigger than what has been asked in the question. The methods are much of what Geeta says, that collective calling out is your answer. I would just add one more word because with arts, Sanskriti, Sanskari is also greatly associated, that while your language needs to be polite and parliamentary, it should not compromise on describing completely what is objectionable. Communication is the biggest thing. If you pick up one voice and speak, like for the Kathakendra girl, her bravery is amazing. Not only did she go to the police, she's the only voice that is speaking. But if you were to speak together, if an institution has an ICC in place, if that ICC has annual trainings as the POSH Act allows or mandates, then many of these issues, before they can become putrid sores, may actually be discussed in milder language and be done with. Yesterday, somebody asked me, but there was an earlier in September articulation of sexual harassment in an institution with North Indian music and dance kind of a thing. And why didn't the lessons get learned? Because everybody, most of the male gurus have this iconic position. Most of the male gurus, by being male, have the Raja Beta syndrome that they have been brought up with, and the sense of entitlement. Once you reach that guru status, men, women, everybody feels entitled. And we reinforce it. We touch their feet every day. We are inferior, you're superior. How then do you sort of gain the courage and confidence to call out? So you need to question a lot of things. Every festival in India is demeaning sometimes to women. You know, Rakhi, you tie it to a brother's hand because you're inadequate. Somebody has to come to save you. Otherwise, you can't do it. In North India, there's this really sicko festival called Karva Chauth. That really freaks me out. Male life more important than female life. So we need to keep questioning. I was a terrible grandchild, I guess, in my family, because I would ask these embarrassing questions in family gatherings. But we need to keep questioning. We need to keep talking. And there are possibilities of addressing.
To Masoom, I just wanted to pick on a very important point made by Tushar on
Yes,
calling out cultures and versus calling in cultures.
Yes, please.
So that's exactly what, Tushar, thank you for saying that, because that's exactly what we are trying to say here, that it is not the individual that you have to call out. The individuals have to be held accountable, right? There is no question about that. But how we hold them accountable is a very crucial point, especially as Arsia has been saying right from the beginning. It's not just about the law. It's also about the ethics of our politics, right? So we live in a world of canceling out. We live in a world of very woke cultures of calling out. So while we are talking about that, I think our intention also, I'm glad that you brought this up, is to say that we need to do this compassionately. We need to take people along. We need to call in people, educate, as I said, your gurus. But if that fails, and if the abuse is really toxic and brutal, then I think we need to really be much firmer. Yeah. So, but definitely, Tushar, for pointing that out. Sorry, Masoom, I jumped.
Thank you so much for that. Sanjukta, Asta, do you want to respond to this question or shall we move ahead?
Shall we?
Yeah.
I think we should start
Okay.
going towards.
So there are some really interesting questions in the chat, but unfortunately, because of the time frame, we cannot answer everything. But this chat is going to be saved. So we will make sure that we respond to you on your email addresses that we have. We will definitely do that. I now invite Ashia to just guide us on the way forward, just to give her thoughts on the subject.
Thank you very much, Masoom. Today we've had such an extensive conversation. So many points have come up, so many ways to go ahead, and all of them must be gone ahead on. So I say that the reason we are doing it is not about shaming, naming, or in any way demeaning anyone. It is about creating a safer, more progressive, positive, just, and egalitarian environment and space in the arts. It's a future oriented desire. But even as I say future oriented, I must mention two things. One, whatever work we are doing, remember, is work that we are doing on the shoulders of those who have done it in more difficult and harder times to be able to even have this kind of a conversation. So we are very grateful to them, and it's on their shoulders that we build the work ahead. Past oriented work and future oriented work both have to be done. People's strengths are in different areas, and I would urge you to look at yourself and feel your strength and then put your weight behind that aspect. Past oriented work would be like which past oriented work is extremely valuable. It gives us the insight and the doorways for any future oriented work. So past oriented work would need healing circles, listening circles, hand holdings, support, which Natalia has so eloquently described. And I may get sort of have my head bitten off for this, but uh, as somebody who sort of works on two fields of academia and the arts, I think collecting narratives, archives of abusive behavior, um, anonymously, even anonymously, helps us notice patterns, identify trends, pick up possible ways of stopping a situation before it can become very toxic. Archives, therefore, are very important, but must be respected with in every possible way that we have acceptable to respect an archival collection. Work that needs to be done in a future-oriented manner, uh, breaking the enabling ethos, the cultures of silence and in environments by speaking up and calling in is critical. So I urge all the many dancers, artists, musicians, scholars, academics, stakeholders in the arts. This is a performing arts specific group to talk about it. Use your iconic status as artists to talk about issues that concern you. I think to talk about the disturbing nature of some of the traditional compositions of, say, Kathak, the style that I have learned, so feel more confident talking about it, and making it a major point in press interview that you have, for instance, draws our attention to these issues. It may not be you, but it may be some other fence-sitting artists who will, it'll suddenly strike them and they will start questioning, refuse to perform such pieces, question, write about it. Write about it where? Everywhere that you can think of. If you have access to press, right there. If you have access to social media, right there. It's extremely powerful, extremely powerful. We have seen how social media has been able to bring giants down on their knees, corporate giants down on their knees. So articles in multiple languages. This is very important. You know, already I have got a request in response to the invitations I sent out for this, to do it at least in Hindi. And I really think that is one of our next steps, immediate next steps, to do this training in Hindi. Be alert, be forensic, and speak up. I can't stop stressing it enough. What do I mean by be alert and be forensic? You know, the courts deal with evidence. What constitutes evidence is very important to understand. If there is any lawyer in this group, and I know Pranali in Beej is a lawyer, they will be able to tell you that only that which falls under the Evidence Act constitutes evidence. So if you get a WhatsApp message which is inappropriate, don't delete it in shock and horror. Retain it. It is your evidence that you have to submit for any action should things reach the point where proper institutional legal action has to be taken. Speak through your dance and your music and your theater, your artistry. Nika, the Nika piece that you have created, Beej Sanjukta, Nika Interrupted, is a very valuable piece. It should be like the centerpiece, not an also ran in any showcasing. Question, yeah, what should I say? So one of the agendas of this session was to create future members of an ICC. These are not just randomly selected members that I would like. My dream is to have empowered, sensitized, trained members. So somebody asked a question about trainings. Can ICC members be trained for the arts? You know, no one understands the arts better than you do. So the external member who will be brought into any ICC should ideally not be from the field and would probably not know the nuances of what you know. So you must populate all the future ICCs that we hope will get created. And there are a lot of other chota points, but the one point that I want to end off with, because we're running out of time, is with immediate effect. Those of you who believe in this Mohim and who have institutions, please set up your ICCs. Begin the training. Ladkhadate kadam bhi ho, koi baat nahi. Just start. Then things fall into place. You learn on the job. You learn as you apply your mind to issues. Every time there will be a training, and believe you me, there will be many trainings that Grief Foundation will offer. I don't know if every time Beej will be a partner, but certainly we will look upon Beej as a continuous partner in all our efforts. So we will be doing the trainings. Please do join those trainings. And it saddens me when I see artists who say, हम तो arts में मग्न हैं और हमको और किसी चीज से कोई मतलब नहीं है. मतलब है. Every minute of your life is being controlled by things. Time that we grab control of our own lives and try and direct it in the way and ways we want it to go. So with the promise of being there for the future, this is where I'll end off. Thanking everyone. Asya, you were brilliant. Absolutely.
Thank you. I would just like to say, on behalf of Neha Kutsarkar, Pranali Kakre, and myself, the founders of Beej, a huge thank you to Asya for that absolutely session that shook us and is going to is a starting point for many things to come. Arshia, you have been the inspiration for this, and your whole series on arts and the law, I urge everyone who's here to watch. And the Cree Foundation, Natalia, for joining us and giving us your invaluable support. Geeta for joining us, Shivani and Alora for holding space, and each and every one of you really, because your presence here means such a lot. And this is not just one step. I would just like each of us to visualize our next step. What your next step? It could be just as simple as unmuting unto yourself. You know, that could be your next step. or it could be setting up a committee, or it could be putting up a poster, or it could be calling someone in, or it could be holding a hand. Your next step is yours and it's ours. So please write into us, because our next step is going to have us in the circle of Unmute. It's not a Beej and Cree Foundation initiative. We have no hold over it. It's an performing arts community initiative. And I would just like to end with, I prize on when I step into a classroom or a rehearsal room or a stage, the thing that I prize most is my right to be vulnerable. My right to be the vulnerable body, which can then access my art fully, completely, and magnificently as it's meant to be, not a diminished self. So let's reclaim that space of the vulnerable body in a held, caring, compassionate environment. This is an intention set at the beginning of 2021. Let's all hold this intention together and carry on. Thank you so, so much.
We must thank Masoom.
Masoom, if it wasn't
No.
If it wasn't for
session
Masoom,
would not have we'll have another series on if it wasn't for Masoom.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in today. I have put in contact details of Beej and Cree on the chat box. In case somebody wants to get in touch with us, you can please write to us. Yes, there will be many more sessions. We will hopefully gather periodically and have this dialogue, and this won't be a one-time thing. Thank you. Good evening. Hope you all have a nice weekend.